The widow dug a pit on the inherited ranch and found a wealth no one could have imagined. Rachel thrust the shovel into the hard earth once more, feeling sweat trickle down her forehead, even with the morning sun still low. For 3 days, she had been trying to dig that pit to install the new water system, but the ground was tougher than she expected. What should have been a simple job was turning into a daily battle against the rocky soil of the ranch she had inherited from her husband. With every shovelful, she remembered her mother-in-law's harsh words from the previous week. Mrs. Eleanor had made it very clear that she did not accept a stranger running the property that had been in the family for 3 generations. Even after 2 years of living there with Daniel, even after everything they had built together, Rachel was still seen as an intruder by her late husband's relatives. Daniel had passed away just 6 months ago, leaving her alone at 28 to face not only the pain of loss, but also the pressures from his family. The will was clear. The Cedar Creek Ranch, 15 acres in rural Kentucky, near the town of Riverside Falls, belonged entirely to her. But that didn't stop Richard, Rachel's brother-in-law, from constantly showing up and questioning every decision she made. The shovel hit something solid, producing a metallic sound different from the stones she had been encountering. Rachel stopped, wiped her forehead with the back of her hand, and looked into the nearly 3-foot-deep hole she had dug. There was something that definitely wasn't a common stone. It was rectangular and seemed to be made of metal. Her heart raced. After so long struggling to keep the ranch running alone, after so many sleepless nights wondering how she would pay the bills, perhaps fate was giving her an opportunity. But at the same time, a worry took hold of her. If it was something valuable, Richard would certainly try to take possession, claiming family rights. Rachel looked around to make sure she was alone. The nearest house was Mr. Henry's, about 300 yards away, and she could see he was tending to the cattle in the pasture on the other side of the property. She took a deep breath and started digging again, this time more carefully, trying to discover the exact size of the buried object. It was larger than she had initially imagined. It seemed to be a box or chest, with details that shone even covered in dirt. Her hands trembled as she managed to free one side completely. She was certain now. It was an old chest, possibly made of gilded metal or bronze, with decorations that looked very elaborate. The sound of an approaching car made her stop immediately. She recognized the engine noise. It was Richard's pickup truck. Quickly, she covered the chest with the dirt she had removed and scattered some tools on top, disguising the spot. When Richard arrived near where she was working, Rachel was already a few yards away, pretending to check the water pump. "Good morning, Rachel," said Richard, getting out of his truck with his usual authoritative posture. At 42, he had the typical manner of someone who had always bossed others around, especially the women in the family. "I came to see how the work is progressing." "Good morning, Richard. It's going well, thank you for your concern," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady despite her anxiety. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out, now continuing. "Rachel, we need to talk about something important," said Richard, approaching her with a serious expression. "Mom is not at all happy with this whole situation. She thinks you should consider selling the ranch to the family. We can offer a good price above market value." The offer was not new. Ever since Daniel had left, the family had been harping on the same note. They wanted her to sell everything and leave, handing the property over to the Harrisons as it had always been. "Richard, we've talked about this several times. Daniel left the ranch to me and I intend to stay. This is my home now," said Rachel, crossing her arms. "Home?" Richard let out a humorless laugh. "Rachel, you weren't even born here. You don't have roots in this land like we do. And just look at the state of things." He gestured toward the pastures. "The herd is shrinking. The fences need repair, and you're out here playing at digging holes." "I'm not playing, I'm improving the infrastructure," she replied, feeling her face flush with anger. "Improving?" Richard walked toward the spot where she had been digging. Rachel felt her stomach tighten. "What kind of improvement is this? It looks like just any old hole." He looked closer, and Rachel realized maybe she hadn't disguised it as well as she thought. Richard was observant and knew every inch of that land. "It's to install a more efficient irrigation system," she lied quickly. "I'm going to connect it to the artesian well behind the house." Richard looked at her suspiciously, but didn't press the issue. Instead, he changed tactics. "Rachel, I'll be direct with you. The family is considering contesting the will. Daniel was very shaken in the last months of his life, and we can prove he wasn't in the right state of mind to make such important decisions." The revelation was like a punch to the gut. Rachel knew they didn't like her, but she never imagined they would go this far. "That's a lie, and you know it," she said, trying to control her voice. "Daniel was perfectly lucid when he made the will. In fact, he insisted that everything be officially notarized. Rachel, we don't want to fight with you. That's why I'm here offering a friendly way out. Accept our offer, take the money, and start your life over somewhere else. Everyone wins." "And if I don't accept?" Richard shrugged, but his eyes held a coldness Rachel had never seen before. "Then things could get more complicated. The family has resources, Rachel. We can hire the best lawyers in the region. Can you afford a legal battle that could last for years?" The threat was clear. They would use their financial power to pressure her until she gave up. Rachel felt a mix of outrage and fear. Outrage at being treated this way, and fear because she knew Richard wasn't bluffing. "I'll think about what you said," she replied, just to end the conversation. "Great, but don't take too long to decide. Mom is anxious to resolve this matter." Richard walked back to the pickup truck. "Oh, and Rachel, be careful with these holes you're digging. The land here is treacherous. Sometimes you think you'll find water and only find trouble." After Richard left, Rachel stood still for several minutes, processing the conversation. The threat to contest the will was serious, and she truly didn't have the resources to face a prolonged legal battle. Daniel had some money saved, but not enough to pay for expensive lawyers for years. It was then that she remembered the buried chest. Perhaps the solution to her problems lay there, or perhaps just more complications, but she needed to know what it was. She waited until she was sure Richard was completely gone before returning to the excavation site. She removed the tools and the dirt she had used for disguise and continued digging around the buried object. 2 hours later, she managed to completely free the chest from the earth. It was even more beautiful than she had imagined. Made of aged bronze with carved details representing leaves and flowers. There was an old padlock, but it seemed to have been damaged by time and the dampness of the earth. Its weight was considerable. Rachel estimated it must have been at least 10 pounds. She tried to lift it, but it was too heavy for her alone. She needed help, but who could she trust? Mr. Henry was an option. The 65-year-old neighbor had been friends with Daniel since childhood and had always been kind to her. But what if he told other people? What if the news reached the ears of the Harrison family? She decided to try opening the trunk right there before asking for help to remove it. She grabbed a screwdriver from one of Daniel's toolboxes and tried to force the padlock. After a few attempts, she managed to break it. Her hands were trembling as she lifted the lid of the trunk. What she saw left her breathless. Inside were several bags of aged leather, each filled with old coins. But they weren't ordinary coins. Some appeared to be gold, others silver. And there were also some old banknotes, very well preserved despite the years. Besides the money, there were documents rolled up and tied with red ribbons that had already faded. Rachel carefully took one of the scrolls and partially unrolled it. It was a handwritten document in an old, elaborate script that she had difficulty deciphering. She managed to read a few scattered words. Property, Riverside Falls, Mitchell family. Her heart raced. Mitchell was the maiden name of Daniel's grandmother, Mrs. Catherine, who had passed away more than 15 years ago. There were also some jewels, a pearl necklace, some rings with stones that looked precious, and a gold cross with a delicate chain. Rachel sat on the floor beside the trunk, trying to process what she was seeing. It was definitely a fortune. But where had it come from? Why was it buried there, and why had Daniel never mentioned anything about it? The sun was getting stronger, and she realized she needed to make some quick decisions. She couldn't leave the trunk there exposed, but she also couldn't take it home alone. And above all, she needed to understand what those documents said. She decided the first thing to do was to store everything safely. She closed the trunk again and covered it with a tarp that was in the tool shed. Then she disguised the spot with branches and dry leaves. She took only some of the documents and one of the smaller bags of coins, hiding them in her blouse. She needed someone to help her decipher those old papers, and she knew exactly who to turn to. Father William from the local church was known for his scholarship and for knowing the region's history well. Besides, Daniel always said he was a person of absolute trust. If anyone could help her understand those documents without spreading the news, it would be him. The church was about a 15-minute drive from the property. Rachel took a quick shower, changed her clothes and headed there, carrying the documents hidden in a bag. Father William was in the church garden when she arrived, tending to the flower beds he had planted himself. He was a man in his 70s, with white hair and kind blue eyes, who always welcomed everyone with a warm smile. "Rachel, my child, what a joy to see you," he said, taking off his gardening gloves. "How are you feeling?" "Hi, Father William. I'm fine, thank you. Actually, I came here because I need your help with something." "Of course, count on me. Shall we talk inside?" They entered the parish house, a simple but cozy building, with shelves full of books and an old wooden table where Father William usually studied. "Father, I found some old documents at the ranch and I can't quite understand what's written. Could you take a look?" "Of course, my child. Old documents can be very interesting. Sometimes they tell us stories that have long been forgotten." Rachel took the papers from her bag and handed them to the priest, who put on his glasses and began to examine them carefully. This is handwriting from the early last century," he murmured, leaning over the documents. "Let me see. This talks about a land transaction. A certain John Mitchell sold a property to—" Father William stopped speaking and looked at Rachel with surprise. "Rachel, where exactly did you find these documents?" "At the ranch, Father." "Why? Is there a problem?" The priest reread a few passages before answering. "My child, according to what is written here, the property you inherited from Daniel was purchased illegally by the Harrison family over 80 years ago." The revelation was like a bolt of lightning. Rachel felt her legs weaken and leaned on the table. "What do you mean, Father?" "From what I understand in this document, John Mitchell, who was the original owner of the land, was forced to sell to the Harrisons' grandfather for a price well below market value. There are indications of coercion and even threats." Father William continued reading, translating the old-fashioned language. "It says here that John Mitchell wrote this document as a kind of will, recording that the sale was not legitimate, and that he hoped the truth would one day come to light. He buried these papers along with the family's savings as proof of what had happened." Rachel sat down heavily in one of the chairs. The implications of what she was hearing were enormous. "Does that mean that—" "It means that the true owners of that land are the descendants of John Mitchell, not the Harrisons. And considering that Daniel's grandmother, Mrs. Catherine, was the daughter of John Mitchell—" The priest made a significant pause. "Daniel was the rightful heir," Rachel completed, feeling a mix of relief and worry. "Exactly, and now you as his widow." The relief was short-lived. If this information became public, it would not only prove she had a right to the land, but also reveal that the Harrison family had built its wealth on a property obtained illegally. "Father, what do I do with this information?" "My child, that is a decision only you can make. But I would say the truth should always prevail, no matter how difficult." Rachel left the church with her head buzzing with thoughts. She held in her hands the proof that the Harrison family had no right to that land, but she also knew that revealing this information would cause an unprecedented family war. When she got home, she found Mrs. Eleanor, her mother-in-law, sitting on the porch of the main house. The 68-year-old woman had a rigid posture and a gaze that had always seemed to judge Rachel as inadequate for her son. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Eleanor," said Rachel, trying to maintain a cordial tone. "Rachel, I came here to speak with you personally about Richard's proposal." Her mother-in-law's voice was firm, without any trace of maternal warmth. "I hope you have enough common sense to accept." "Mrs. Eleanor, I already told Richard I would think about it." "Think about it?" The mother-in-law stood up, showing all her indignation. "Rachel, you don't understand the situation. This land has belonged to our family for 4 generations. My great-grandfather bought this property when there was nothing here but wilderness. We built everything you see here." Rachel felt a bitter irony. If Mrs. Eleanor knew the truth about how her great-grandfather had bought that land, she might change her tone. "Mrs. Eleanor, Daniel wanted me to stay here. He knew what he was doing." Daniel was ill, Rachel. He wasn't thinking straight. Her mother-in-law took a few steps toward her. "You are young, you can rebuild your life somewhere else. But for us, this land is everything. It's our identity, our history. And it was Daniel's identity and history too," Rachel retorted. "He brought me here because he wanted me to be part of that history." "You will never be part of our history," said Mrs. Eleanor coldly. "You are a stranger who managed to deceive my son in the last years of his life. But that doesn't give you the right to everything our family fought for." The cruelty of the words wounded Rachel deeply. She and Daniel had met in the city, where she worked as a teacher, and the love between them had been genuine and deep. To say she had deceived Daniel was an offense not only to her, but to his memory. "Mrs. Eleanor, you are being unfair. Daniel and I loved each other." "Love?" Her mother-in-law laughed scornfully. "Rachel, you are 28 and he was 35. You were after security, not love. And you got what you wanted." Rachel felt tears of anger and sorrow welling in her eyes, but she forced herself not to cry in front of her mother-in-law. "I will not sell the ranch, Mrs. Eleanor. This was Daniel's wish, and I will respect it." Her mother-in-law was silent for a few seconds, her cold eyes studying Rachel. "So you have chosen the hard path," she said finally. "Very well, but don't say we didn't try to resolve this civilly." After Mrs. Eleanor left, Rachel locked herself in the house and cried out everything she had held back during the conversation. She felt completely alone, surrounded by people who saw her as an enemy and threatened everything Daniel had left for her. But now she had a secret weapon. The documents proved not only that she had a right to that land, but that the Harrisons were the trespassers. The question was, should she use that information? That night, Rachel could barely sleep. She kept thinking about all the implications of revealing the truth about the origin of the property. On one hand, it would solve her problems and definitively prove she had a right to the land. On the other hand, it would destroy an entire family and could generate even greater conflicts. Furthermore, there was the matter of the buried treasure. The coins and jewels she found would be worth a fortune, enough to secure her financially for many years. But if she revealed the documents, she would also be forced to reveal how she found them, and that could complicate the situation in ways she couldn't even imagine. The next morning, she decided she needed more information before making any decision. She returned to the spot where she had found the chest, but this time she took a larger hoe and a shovel. She wanted to be sure there was nothing else buried there. She dug in a wider radius around the original spot, and to her surprise found a few more things. First, it was a smaller wooden box, which contained yellowed letters. Then she found a leather pouch with more coins and some old tools that seemed to have historical value. The letters were in better condition than the official documents. They were correspondence between John Mitchell and his wife, Mary Mitchell, written during the period when he was being pressured to sell the land. Reading the letters, Rachel discovered a story of suffering and injustice that moved her deeply. John Mitchell described how he was being threatened by the patriarch of the Harrison family, who wanted his land at any cost. He spoke of the fear he felt for his family, and how he was being forced to accept a ridiculous price for the property he had built with so much effort. In one of the letters, John wrote to his wife, "My dear Mary, I am burying our savings and these documents in the hope that one day, when I am no longer here, our daughter Catherine or her descendants can use this evidence to reclaim what is rightfully ours." Catherine was Daniel's grandmother. This confirmed everything Father William had said about the documents. Rachel felt connected to that story in a way she hadn't expected. John Mitchell had been driven from his own land by powerful people, just as she was being pressured now. The difference was that he hadn't had the resources to defend himself, while she now had the evidence she needed. She was interrupted in her reflections by the sound of approaching voices. Quickly, she covered everything again and moved away from the spot. It was Mr. Henry, accompanied by another man she didn't know. "Good morning, Rachel," greeted Mr. Henry. "This here is Attorney David, a lawyer from the city. He wanted to speak with you." Rachel's heart raced. Had the Harrisons already begun legal proceedings to contest the will? "Good morning, Mrs. Rachel," said the lawyer, a man in his 50s, wearing a simple but well-kept suit. "May I speak with you for a moment?" "Of course, Attorney David. Shall we go to the house?" "Actually, I'd prefer to talk right here if you don't mind. It's about the matter of your husband's will." Rachel felt her legs go weak. "Did the Harrison family hire you?" "No, ma'am. Actually, I was hired by someone else. Do you know Mrs. Margaret Mitchell?" The name wasn't familiar to Rachel. "No, I don't." "Mrs. Margaret is a second cousin of your late husband, daughter of a brother of Mrs. Catherine, Carlos's grandmother. She lives in Charlotte and learned of your situation through acquaintances here in the region." Rachel didn't understand where this was going. "And what does she want with me?" "Mrs. Margaret has some old family documents that may be relevant to your case. She would like to meet with you to show these papers." The coincidence was striking. Rachel had just found Mitchell family documents buried on her property, and now a relative of Carlos appeared with more documents from the same family. "What kind of documents?" she asked. "Old deeds, family correspondence, some records of land transactions. Mrs. Margaret said they could help prove that your husband's will is legitimate and that you have every right to this property." "And why does she want to help me?" Attorney David smiled. "She said she was always very fond of Carlos, even though they didn't see each other often, and that she can't stand injustice, especially when it's committed by people who think they own the truth." Rachel decided to accept the meeting. Perhaps Mrs. Margaret had information that complemented what she had discovered. "When would she like to meet? If you agree, she can come here tomorrow morning. She prefers not to meet in town to avoid gossip." After the lawyer and Mr. Henry left, Rachel kept thinking about the situation. In less than 24 hours, her reality had completely changed. From a widow pressured to sell her inheritance, she had become the holder of evidence that could turn the entire history of the region upside down. But something bothered her. It was too much of a coincidence for an unknown relative of Carlos to appear just now with documents that could help her. What if it was a trap by the Harrisons? What if Mrs. Margaret was actually someone they had hired to try to find out what she knew? She decided to be cautious. She wouldn't mention anything about the documents she had found until she was sure who Mrs. Margaret was and what her true intentions were. That night, she made a call to Father William. "Father, do you know a certain Mrs. Margaret Mitchell? She says she's Carlos's cousin. Margaret Mitchell, let me think. Yes, I know Mrs. Margaret. She is the daughter of Benedict Mitchell, who was a brother of Mrs. Catherine, a very serious and honest woman. Why do you ask?" "She wants to meet with me tomorrow. She says she has documents that might help me." "How interesting. Mrs. Margaret really has always kept a lot of old family papers. If she says she has something that can help you, it's probably true. She's not one to make empty promises." The relief Rachel felt was immense. At least Mrs. Margaret seemed to be a trustworthy person. The next day, Rachel woke up early and prepared the house for the visit. She carefully stored all the documents and objects she had found in a safe place, determined not to reveal anything until she was absolutely sure about Mrs. Margaret's intentions. Around 9 in the morning, a modest car arrived at the property. Out of it stepped a robust lady with graying hair tied in a bun, wearing a simple but elegant dress. Beside her was Attorney David, the lawyer from the previous day. "Good morning, my dear," greeted Mrs. Margaret with a firm but warm voice. "You must be Rachel. I'm so very sorry for your loss of Daniel. He was a very special boy." There was something in the way Mrs. Margaret spoke that conveyed sincerity. Rachel felt more at ease. "Thank you, Mrs. Margaret. Please come in. Can I offer you some coffee?" "That would be lovely, dear." They settled in the house's living room, which still had many features of the decor Daniel had chosen. Mrs. Margaret looked around nostalgically. "This house has barely changed since I was a child and would come visit Aunt Catherine," she commented. "Daniel always liked to keep things as they were." "You knew Daniel well?" "Not as well as I would have liked. Our family sort of drifted apart after Aunt Catherine passed, and everyone went their own way. But I always had a special fondness for him." Mrs. Margaret picked up a folder she had brought. "That's why when I learned about the situation you're facing with the Harrison family, I decided it was time to reveal some things I've been keeping for many years." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to leave a like and especially to subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, continuing. What kind of things? Asked Rachel, feeling her heart race. Mrs. Margaret opened the folder and took out several old documents, carefully organized. My dear, what I'm about to tell you could completely change your perspective on this property and the Harrison family. She handed one of the documents to Rachel. This is the original will of my grandfather, John Mitchell, written shortly before he died. In it, he makes it clear that the sale of this property to the Harrison family was made under coercion, and that he considers the transaction illegal. Rachel feigned surprise, but inside she was elated. The documents Mrs. Margaret had perfectly complemented the ones she had found. Furthermore, continued Mrs. Margaret, I have here letters my grandfather exchanged with lawyers of the time, trying to find a way to annul the sale. And I also have statements from neighbors confirming that the Harrison family used intimidation to force the sale. Attorney David leaned forward. Mrs. Rachel, with these documents, we can not only prove that your husband's will is valid, but we can also challenge the Harrisons' very ownership of the land. But won't that start an endless legal war? Mrs. Margaret smiled with determination. My dear, sometimes a war is necessary for justice to be done. My grandfather died knowing he had been cheated, and my grandmother lived the rest of her life in poverty because of the Harrisons' greed. The time has come to settle the score. Mrs. Margaret, may I ask why you decided to reveal this now? Why not years ago? Because I didn't have the courage to face the Harrison family alone. They are powerful, they have influence in the region. But when I learned you were being pressured the same way my grandfather was, I decided I couldn't stay silent. Rachel was moved by the elderly lady's courage and determination. And what do you propose we do? First, we'll use these documents to ensure you keep possession of this property. Then, if you agree, we can file a lawsuit questioning the legitimacy of the Harrisons' claim to the rest of the lands that originally belonged to the Mitchell family. The rest of the lands? Attorney David took an old map from the folder. Mrs. Rachel, the original property of John Mitchell included not only this ranch where you live, but also another 200 acres that now belong to the Harrisons. We're talking about an area worth many millions of dollars. The information left Rachel stunned. If it were true, the Harrison family had built their entire fortune on stolen land. That means that you and Mrs. Margaret are the rightful heirs to one of the largest rural estates in the region, the attorney completed. Rachel needed time to process all of this. It was too much information to absorb at once. Can I speak with you both again tomorrow? I need to think about all this. Of course, my dear, said Mrs. Margaret, putting the documents away. But remember one thing. The truth is not in a hurry, but injustice cannot wait forever. After they left, Rachel went to the spot where she had hidden the chest. Now that she knew Mrs. Margaret was trustworthy, she decided it was time to reveal her discovery. She removed the chest from its hiding place and brought it home with great effort. It was too heavy for her alone, but she managed to drag it using a handcart she found in the workshop. Once home, she spread the entire contents of the chest on the living room table. Old coins, jewelry, documents, letters. It all formed an impressive collection that told the story of a family destroyed by greed. She picked up the phone and called Mrs. Margaret. Mrs. Margaret, it's Rachel. Could you come back here this afternoon? I have something very important to show you. Of course, dear. Did something happen? Let's say I found some items that will complement the documents you brought. When Mrs. Margaret and Attorney David returned, Rachel led them directly to the room where she had laid out all the contents of the chest. The silence was absolute for several seconds. Mrs. Margaret brought her hands to her face, emotional. My goodness, Chu, where did you find all this? Buried here on the ranch. I was digging a pit when I found the chest. Attorney David approached the table, examining the coins and documents with admiration. Mrs. Rachel, this here is worth a fortune. Some of these coins are pure gold, others are extremely rare pieces for collectors. Mrs. Margaret picked up one of the letters with trembling hands. This is my grandfather's handwriting, she said, emotional. And this letter, he talks about burying the family's savings so that one day the descendants could recover them. "This confirms everything in the documents you brought," said Rachel. "Now we have material evidence and testimonial evidence." "My dear," said Mrs. Margaret, "do you understand what this means? With this treasure and the documents, you have a way to support yourself throughout the entire legal process, no matter how long it takes." It was true. The value of the coins and jewelry would be enough to pay for the best lawyers and still ensure her livelihood for many years. "Mrs. Margaret, what do you think we should do?" The older lady sat down and was thoughtful for a few minutes. "Rachel, I'll be honest with you. If we decide to move forward with this, there will be no turning back. The Harrison family will use every resource they have to destroy us. They have money, influence, connections. It will be a difficult and draining battle. And if we do nothing, then the injustice continues. You lose your home, and my grandfather will remain without his name cleared." Attorney David intervened. "Ladies, may I give my legal opinion? With the evidence we have, our chance of winning is very high. The problem isn't winning the lawsuit, it's surviving the attacks that will come before that." "What kind of attacks?" asked Rachel. "The Harrisons will try to discredit you, they'll spread lies, they might even try to sabotage the property. People with power act this way when they feel threatened." Rachel thought of Richard and Mrs. Eleanor. If they knew what she had discovered, they would probably do anything to stop her from proceeding. "Attorney David, if we decide to move forward, what would be the first step?" "First, we store all the evidence in a safe place, preferably in a bank. Then, we file a preliminary injunction to ensure the property cannot be transferred during the proceedings, and simultaneously, we initiate the main lawsuit, challenging the legitimacy of the Harrisons' possession of the lands." "And how long would that take?" "With the evidence we have, between 6 months and 2 years, depending on how many appeals they file." Mrs. Margaret looked at Rachel. "Dear, the decision is yours. You are the one with the most to lose or gain from this." Rachel looked at the treasure spread on the table, then at Mrs. Margaret, a lady of nearly 70, who had kept documents for decades waiting for the right moment to seek justice. "Mrs. Margaret, you've spent your entire life knowing your family was the victim of an injustice. I cannot be responsible for perpetuating that situation." She took a deep breath. "Let's move forward. Let's seek the justice your grandfather deserved." Mrs. Margaret smiled and held Rachel's hands. "My child, you don't know the relief I feel hearing this. Finally, we will be able to honor Grandpa John's memory." Attorney David began taking notes. "Very well, ladies. Let's start by organizing all the evidence, and I suggest you be very discreet about this. Until we have everything legally protected, it's best the Harrison family doesn't know what we are planning." Rachel knew keeping a secret would be difficult. Richard came to the ranch almost every day, always inventing some excuse, but clearly watching her activities. "Attorney, how long do we need to organize everything?" "A week, at most. I will prepare all the documentation and arrange the safe deposit box at the bank." Mrs. Margaret stood up. "Rachel, may I stay here during this week? That way we can work together on the organization, and I can also keep an eye out to ensure no one discovers what we are doing." The proposal was perfect. Having Mrs. Margaret nearby would give Rachel not only an ally, but also company. Since Daniel's departure, she had felt very alone in that house. "Of course, Mrs. Margaret, it would be wonderful to have your company." For the rest of the afternoon, they carefully catalogued everything in the trunk. By the end, they had an impressive list. 127 gold coins from different eras, 89 old silver coins, 15 pieces of jewelry with precious stones, 12 official documents from the time of the forced sale, 28 letters from family correspondence, 3 old maps of the original property. An amount in old currency that, according to Attorney David, would be equivalent to about 50,000 reais today. "Attorney David," said Rachel, "how much could all this be worth?" "It's hard to estimate without a professional appraisal, but I believe we are talking about at least 2 million reais, possibly more." The figure was staggering. Rachel had never imagined she would one day have access to so much money. "And does all this belong to me?" "Legally, yes. John Mitchell buried these things on his property, and you are the current legal owner of the land." Moreover, as the heir of Daniel, who was the great-grandson of John Mitchell, you have hereditary rights to the Mitchell family assets. When Attorney David left, Rachel and Mrs. Margaret Mitchell talked until late at night. The older woman told stories about the Mitchell family, about what the region was like before the Harrisons became the dominant family, and about the hardships her family endured after the forced sale of the property. Rachel, my grandfather died bitter. He knew he had been deceived, but he didn't have the strength to fight the Harrisons. My grandmother went through hardships no one deserves to go through. Why didn't the family try to do anything before? Fear, my dear. The Harrisons have always been very influential. They had friends in the courts, in the local administration, and we were just simple people, without the resources to face a powerful family. And now things have changed. We have evidence, we have resources, and we have a just cause. Besides, Mrs. Margaret smiled, I'm too old to be afraid. The next day, Richard showed up in the morning as Rachel had expected. She and Mrs. Margaret were in the kitchen having coffee when he arrived. Good morning, Rachel. Who is this lady? He asked, looking at Mrs. Margaret with suspicion. Richard, this is Mrs. Margaret Mitchell, Daniel's cousin. She came to visit me. Mitchell? Richard seemed interested. Mrs. Mitchell, are you related to the Harrisons as well? Mrs. Margaret answered with an innocent smile. No, young man. I am from the Mitchell family, an old family from the region, but we lost our lands many years ago. Ah, I see. Richard seemed to relax. And where do you currently live, Mom? In Charlotte. But I've always wanted to get to know this region where my family lived better. Richard asked a few polite questions, but Rachel could tell he was trying to find out if Mrs. Margaret represented any kind of threat to his family's plans. Rachel, said Richard, I came to let you know we've scheduled a meeting for tomorrow afternoon with the family's attorney. We would like you to attend so we can discuss the details of the purchase proposal. What kind of details? Value, timeline for transfer, negotiation conditions, nothing major, just to make everything very clear. Rachel looked at Mrs. Margaret, who gave a slight nod. All right, Richard. I will attend the meeting. Great. It will be here at 3 in the afternoon. After Richard left, Mrs. Margaret commented, That boy is too eager to resolve this matter. It makes me think they have some urgency they're not revealing. What kind of urgency? I don't know, but I will ask Attorney David to look into it. Sometimes when people push a negotiation too hard, it's because they have financial problems or deadlines they need to meet. Mrs. Margaret's observation made sense. Richard and Mrs. Eleanor had been pushing very hard for her to sell quickly. Perhaps there was more behind this insistence than the simple desire to keep the property in the family. That same day, Attorney David returned with interesting news. Ladies, I conducted some discreet investigations into the Harrison family's financial situation, and I discovered something very relevant. He sat down and opened a folder with documents. The Harrison family has a very large debt with a group of investors from New York. They used their properties as collateral for a loan of $20 million, which is due at the end of this year. And what does that have to do with their insistence that I sell? Asked Rachel. From what I found out, they are trying to raise capital to pay off this debt. If they can't, they could lose all the properties they put up as collateral. Mrs. Margaret leaned forward. Attorney, does that mean they are desperate? Exactly. And desperate people can do reckless things. The information completely changed the dynamics of the situation. The Harrisons weren't just trying to uphold family tradition, they were fighting for their very financial survival. Attorney David, said Rachel, could this affect our strategy? Definitely. If they are in serious financial trouble, a lawsuit questioning the legitimacy of their properties could be devastating. They will likely do anything to prevent that from happening. Anything like what? They might try bribery, blackmail, or even sabotage. When a lot of money is at stake, people can become very dangerous. Mrs. Margaret looked worriedly at Rachel. My dear, perhaps we should speed up our process. The less time they have to react, the better. I can file the initial documents as early as tomorrow, said Attorney David, but that will mean you must be prepared for an immediate and possibly violent reaction from them. Rachel thought for a few moments. She knew she was entering a war, but she had no choice. If she did nothing, she would lose everything anyway. Attorney David, file the documents tomorrow morning. We can't wait any longer. The next day, while Attorney David was at the courthouse filing the lawsuit, Rachel prepared for the meeting with the Harrison family. Mrs. Margaret had decided to stay out of sight, hidden in one of the rooms of the house. At 3 o'clock sharp, Richard, Mrs. Eleanor, and a man Rachel didn't know arrived wearing an expensive suit and carrying a leather briefcase. "Rachel, this is Attorney Gregory, our lawyer," Richard introduced. Attorney Gregory was a man in his 60s with an imposing posture and a shrewd gaze, the kind of person who intimidates by presence alone. "Mrs. Rachel, it's a pleasure to meet you. I've heard a lot about you." They settled in the living room, and Attorney Gregory opened his briefcase. "Well, let's get straight to the point. The Harrison family is prepared to make a very generous offer for the property. We are talking about 2.5 million reais, paid in cash." The amount was indeed high, well above the market value for a rural property of that size. This confirmed they were truly desperate. "That is a very interesting offer," said Rachel, pretending to consider it. "But I need a few days to think." "Mrs. Rachel," Mrs. Eleanor interjected, "a few days may be too many days. This is a time-limited offer. Why the rush?" Attorney Gregory smiled, but Rachel noticed the smile didn't reach his eyes. "Mrs. Rachel, I'll be frank with you. The Harrison family is undergoing a financial restructuring. This offer is part of a larger plan, and it has a specific deadline to be executed." "What deadline?" 48 hours. The pressure was being ratcheted up drastically. Rachel knew they must not suspect she was aware of their financial problems. "Attorney Gregory, 48 hours is very little time for such an important decision." "Mrs. Rachel," said Richard, leaning forward, "we understand your hesitation. That's why we are prepared to increase the offer to 3 million, but only if you sign today." 3 million reais. It was an amount that would completely change anyone's life. But Rachel knew that if she accepted, she would not only be selling the property, but also burying forever the chance to get justice for the Mitchell family. "I need at least until tomorrow morning to decide," she said. Attorney Gregory closed his briefcase abruptly. "Mrs. Rachel, I will be very clear. This is our final offer. If you don't accept by tomorrow at noon, we will withdraw the offer and pursue other measures." "What other measures?" "Legal measures to contest your husband's will, and I can guarantee it will be a long, expensive, and draining process." The threat was clear. Rachel pretended to be intimidated. "I understand. I'll give you an answer by tomorrow at noon." After they left, Mrs. Margaret came out of hiding. "My dear, they are truly desperate. 3 million is a lot of money. But if I accept, we'll never be able to prove they stole your family's land." "Exactly, and they know it. That's why the rush." That night, Attorney David arrived with news from the records office. "Ladies, I've filed all the documents. The lawsuit has been accepted and is already moving forward. Within a few hours, the Harrison family will be officially notified." "And then?" asked Rachel. "Then the real war begins." As if it were an omen, the phone rang at that moment. At that, it was Richard, and his voice was strained. "Rachel, I need to speak with you urgently. I'm coming over now." "Richard, it's late and—" "It's urgent, Rachel. It can't wait until tomorrow." He hung up before she could respond. "It seems they've already been notified," said Attorney David. "What do we do?" asked Rachel. Mrs. Margaret stood up with determination. "We face them. We've come too far to back down now." 15 minutes later, Richard arrived accompanied by Attorney Gregory and 2 men Rachel didn't know. Everyone seemed very tense. "Rachel, we just received a very strange court notification. Do you know anything about this?" Rachel pretended not to understand. "Notification about what?" Attorney Gregory stepped toward her with a threatening expression. "Mrs. Rachel, someone has filed a lawsuit questioning the legitimacy of the Harrison family's land ownership, and curiously, the lawsuit mentions this property as evidence." "I don't know anything about that." "Mrs. Rachel," said one of the unknown men, "my name is Marcus Patterson, and I've worked for the Harrison family for many years. We handle the security of the family's interests." There was something in the way he said security that made Rachel feel threatened. What does that have to do with me? It has to do with you because you're involved in something very dangerous. Questioning land ownership by traditional families can lead to very serious conflicts. Richard intervened. Rachel, if you know anything about this lawsuit, you'd better tell us now. We can still resolve everything amicably. That's when Mrs. Margaret decided to appear. She came out of the room where she was hiding and walked into the living room. Good evening, gentlemen. I believe you're looking for me. The silence was absolute. Everyone looked at the elderly lady with surprise and concern. Who are you? Asked Attorney Gregory. Margaret Mitchell, great-granddaughter of John Mitchell, the true original owner of these lands. Richard turned pale. You're the one who filed the lawsuit. Rachel and I together, as the legitimate heirs of the Mitchell family. Marcus Patterson took a step forward, in a clearly intimidating posture. Mrs. Mitchell, you don't know who you're dealing with. The Harrison family has a lot of influence in this region. Mrs. Margaret was not intimidated. Young man, I am 69 years old. I've seen a lot in this life, and I'm not frightened by threats. Attorney Gregory tried to regain control of the situation. Ladies, let's be rational. This lawsuit will not succeed. We're talking about events that happened over 80 years ago. There are no living witnesses, no contemporary documents. That's when Mrs. Margaret smiled. Attorney Gregory, you are mistaken. We have documents, many documents, and we also have material evidence. What evidence? Rachel looked at Mrs. Margaret, who gave a confirming nod. I found a chest buried here on the property, a trunk that John Mitchell buried before being forced to sell his land. The revelation caused a visible impact on everyone present. Richard sat down heavily in a chair. What kind of things were in this trunk? He asked in a weak voice. Documents proving the sale was forced, correspondence from the time, and also a treasure that John Mitchell hid so his descendants could recover it. Marcus Patterson whispered something in Attorney Gregory's ear, who grew even more tense. Ladies, you don't know what you're doing. The Harrison family will not allow its reputation to be tarnished by unfounded accusations. They are not accusations, said Mrs. Margaret Mitchell firmly. They are documented facts. Richard stood up abruptly. Rachel, you don't understand what you're doing. My family built everything we have in this region. If this story spreads, it will destroy not just our family, but the entire local economy. Richard, you should have thought of that before threatening to contest Daniel's will. Attorney Gregory signaled for everyone to leave. Ladies, you will hear from us very soon, and I suggest you reconsider this decision before it's too late. After they left, Rachel, Mrs. Margaret Mitchell, and Attorney David stayed talking about the next steps. Attorney David, can they do anything to harm us? Legally, not much. Our evidence is solid. But extra-legally... He paused meaningfully. What does that mean? It means you need to be very careful. People with a lot to lose can do desperate things. Mrs. Margaret Mitchell sat beside Rachel. My dear, there's still time to back down. If you want to accept their offer and forget all this, I will understand. Rachel looked at the woman who had dedicated decades of her life safeguarding documents to seek justice for her family. Mrs. Margaret Mitchell, we are not backing down. We've come too far and our cause is just. Then we'll see it through to the end, come what may. In the following weeks, the situation intensified rapidly. News of the lawsuit began to circulate in town, creating an uproar no one expected. Some older residents began to remember stories their parents and grandparents told about the Mitchell family and about strange circumstances involving the sale of the land to the Harrisons. Father William became a key ally, publicly confirming that the documents presented by Mrs. Margaret Mitchell were authentic and that he himself remembered conversations he had with people who witnessed the events of the time. On the other hand, the Harrison family mobilized all its resources. They hired a team of lawyers from New York, specialists in land issues, and began a campaign to discredit the evidence presented. Richard went so far as to spread rumors that Rachel had forged the documents and planted the trunk to simulate the discovery. But the strategy didn't work, as the evidence was too consistent and had been authenticated by experts. The situation grew even more tense when Attorney David discovered that the Harrison family was trying to quickly sell some of their properties to other buyers in a desperate attempt to raise money before the lawsuit could affect all their holdings. "Ladies," said Attorney David during one of his visits, "I obtained an injunction preventing them from selling any property until the case is resolved. This will increase the pressure on them significantly." "And is that good or bad for us?" asked Rachel. "It's good from a legal standpoint, but it could be dangerous from a personal one. Cornered people can react unpredictably." As if to confirm Attorney David's words, strange incidents began to happen on Rachel's property. First, the water pump mysteriously stopped working. When the technician came to check it, he discovered someone had intentionally damaged the equipment. Then, some cattle were found loose in the pastures, with the fences clearly cut. Fortunately, Mr. Henry helped round up the animals before they were completely lost. The most serious incident happened on a rainy night, when Rachel and Mrs. Margaret heard strange noises around the house. When they went to check the next morning, they found someone had tried to force the door of the storage shed where they kept tools and equipment. "My dear," said Mrs. Margaret, "they're trying to intimidate us." "It's working," admitted Rachel. "I'm starting to get scared." That's when Attorney David suggested they consider staying in town for a few days until the situation stabilized. "No," said Mrs. Margaret firmly. "If we leave here, they'll say we abandoned the property. That could be used against us in the lawsuit. Then what do? We get protection. I'll talk to some of my cousins who live in the area. They can stay here with us for the next few weeks." The arrival of Mrs. Margaret's cousins completely changed the dynamic of the situation. They were 3 men in their 40s and 50s, all experienced farm workers, who took turns providing security for the property. With protection secured, Rachel could focus on the legal proceedings, which were advancing faster than anyone expected. The experts appointed by the judge confirmed the authenticity of all the documents found. The coins and jewelry were appraised, and their value was estimated at nearly 3 million rees. And more importantly, a historical survey confirmed that the Mitchell family had indeed been the owners of all the land that currently belonged to the Harrisons. The most impactful discovery came when researchers found in the town archives records of complaints that John Mitchell had made at the time against the Harrison family. The complaints had been ignored by the authorities of the time, but now served as additional proof that the sale had been forced. On the Harrison family's side, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Unable to sell their properties due to the injunction, they couldn't raise the money needed to pay off their debt to the investors from New York. The pressure grew so great that Mrs. Eleanor had a hypertensive crisis and had to be hospitalized. Richard publicly blamed Rachel for his mother's health condition, which only served to increase the tension between the two parties. It was around this time that the event occurred, which would completely change the course of the story. Rachel was on the house porch, enjoying a cooler late afternoon, when she saw an unfamiliar car approaching. From it stepped an elegantly dressed man with a sophisticated appearance who didn't seem to be from the region. "Good afternoon," he greeted politely. "Are you Rachel Harrison?" "I'm Rachel Anderson. Harrison was my late husband's surname." "My apologies. My name is Stephen Campbell. I'm a financial consultant from New York. I would like to speak with you about the Harrison family's situation." Rachel immediately became alert. Could he be a representative of the family's creditors? "You can speak right here. My friend Mrs. Margaret is also involved in the situation." Stephen looked around, observing the property with interest. "Ms. Rachel, I'll be direct. I represent a group of investors who are owed money by the Harrison family. We are aware of the lawsuit you filed questioning the ownership of the lands. And what does that have to do with you? It has to do with us because the Harrisons' lands are our collateral. If they lose these lands in court, we lose our guarantee." Rachel didn't know where this was going. "And what do you want from me?" Stephen smiled. "We want to propose a settlement that could solve all the problems at once." Mrs. Margaret, who had been listening in silence, spoke up. "What kind of settlement?" "Our group is willing to pay off the entire Harrison family debt and also pay a considerable compensation to you ladies in exchange for you dropping the lawsuit." "How much would that compensation be?" asked Rachel. 10 million reais divided equally between you." The amount was astronomical. 5 million reais for each of them would be enough to ensure comfort for the rest of their lives. "And why would you do this?" asked Mrs. Margaret. "Because even if you win the lawsuit, and you have a good chance of winning, The legal process could take years. We cannot wait that long to recover our investment. Stephen handed a card to Rachel. Think about the offer. It's an opportunity to resolve everything without further strain, without more risks, and with very generous compensation. After he left, Rachel and Mrs. Margaret remained silent for several minutes. Mrs. Margaret, what do you think? My dear, 5 million is a lot of money, more than I ever dreamed of having. But it's not just about the money. It's about justice. It's about clearing my grandfather's name. It's about showing that powerful people cannot do anything with impunity. Rachel knew exactly what Mrs. Margaret was feeling. The money would solve all the practical problems, but it would not bring historical justice. Mrs. Margaret, if we accept this offer, our story ends here. No one will ever know what happened to the Mitchell family. Exactly. And the Harrisons will continue to be seen as a traditional and respectable family. And if we don't accept, then we keep fighting, taking risks, but maintaining the chance for the truth to be known. That night, they called Attorney David and told him about the investor's proposal. Ladies, he said, from a financial standpoint, it's a very attractive offer. From a legal standpoint, you have a great chance of winning much more than that if the lawsuit is successful. How much more? Asked Rachel. If we can prove that all the Harrison properties were acquired illegally, we're talking about an estate worth at least 50 million reais. Mrs. Margaret was impressed. 50 million? It could be even more. The lands have appreciated greatly over the years, and there are also the improvements that were built. But attorney, said Rachel, there's a risk we might not be able to prove all that, right? There is. Although our evidence is solid, the legal system always has unpredictabilities, and considering the Harrison family's influence, they will certainly use every possible resource. It was a difficult decision. 5 million guaranteed versus the possibility of winning much more, but with considerable risks. Attorney David, how long do we have to decide? Stephen said the offer is valid until next Friday. That gives us 5 days. During the following days, Rachel and Mrs. Margaret talked exhaustively about the decision. They weighed all the pros and cons, considered all the risks and possibilities. On the third day, something happened that greatly influenced their decision. Mr. Henry showed up at her house in the morning, visibly shaken. Rachel, I need to tell you something. What is it, Mr. Henry? Last night, Richard came to see me. He offered me money to testify against you. Rachel felt her blood boil. Testify to what? He wants me to say I saw you burying the chest, that this is all a scheme you concocted. Mrs. Margaret stepped closer. And what did you tell him? I told him he was crazy, that I've known Rachel for years and I know she's honest. Mr. Henry paused. But he said if I don't help the Harrison family, they'll make life very difficult for me. The attempt to bribe Mr. Henry was the last straw. It showed that the Harrison family was willing to use any method to win, including perjury. Mr. Henry, said Rachel, do you want to testify for the truth, officially in the trial? Of course, Rachel. I saw when you found that chest. I saw how surprised you were. No one can fake a reaction like that. Attorney David, when he learned of the bribery attempt, was elated. Ladies, this is perfect. Attempted witness bribery is a crime. We can use this both in the civil case and to open a criminal case against Richard. The discovery of the bribery attempt made Rachel and Mrs. Margaret Mitchell realize they could not accept the investor's proposal. If they did that, they would be allowing the Harrison family to continue using dishonest methods to solve their problems. On Friday, when Stephen returned to learn their decision, they were prepared. Mr. Stephen, we've decided not to accept the proposal. Ladies, are you sure? It's a lot of money, and the risk of losing everything is real. We are sure, said Mrs. Margaret Mitchell firmly. Some things are more important than money. Stephen did not insist much. In fact, he seemed to have expected this answer. Very well, then we will await the outcome of the trial. But I can say that our patience with the Harrison family is wearing thin. After he left, Rachel asked Mrs. Margaret Mitchell if she was sure about the decision. My dear, I am 69 years old. Even if I won those 5 million, I wouldn't have much time to enjoy it. But if we can clear my family's name, that will be worth it for generations to come. The trial entered its final phase a few weeks later. They were intense days of hearings, testimonies, and presentation of evidence. Mr. Henry was a key witness, confirming the circumstances of the chest's discovery and revealing the bribery attempt by Richard. Father William also testified, confirming the authenticity of the documents and recounting conversations he had had with long-time residents about the Mitchell family's situation. On the Harrison family's side, the defense tried to question the authenticity of the documents, suggest the chest had been planted, and argue that too much time had passed for the matter to be revisited. But the evidence was too solid. Experts confirmed the documents were authentic to the period, that the coins and jewels were consistent with the time, and that there were no signs the chest had been buried recently. The most dramatic moment of the trial happened when Mrs. Margaret Mitchell was called to testify. She told the entire story of the Mitchell family, with an emotion that touched everyone present, including the judge. "Your Honor," she said, "my grandfather was a hard-working and honest man who built a property with the sweat of his brow. To see that property taken by force and then see my family forgotten by history has been a pain I've carried for decades. I am not here for money. I am here so the truth may be known." When it was Richard's turn to testify, he was visibly shaken. The attempt to bribe Mr. Henry had been a serious mistake, as it clearly showed he was willing to use dishonest methods. The defense attorney tried to downplay the situation, but the damage was already done. The judge made it clear he considered the bribery attempt as evidence that the Harrison family was aware their claims were unfounded. The verdict was delivered on a sunny Friday morning, 3 months after the trial began. Rachel, Mrs. Margaret, Attorney David, and the entire team gathered in the courtroom to hear the decision. The judge was clear and direct. The evidence presented unequivocally proved that the sale of the Mitchell family property to the Harrison family had been made under coercion and was therefore null and void. This meant that all the land currently belonging to the Harrisons should be returned to the legitimate heirs of the Mitchell family, namely Rachel and Mrs. Margaret. Furthermore, the Harrison family was to pay compensation for all the improvements they had enjoyed over the years, plus restitution for the produce they had taken from the land illegally. The total compensation was set at 22 million reis. When the verdict was read, Mrs. Margaret cried. At 69 years old, she had finally achieved the justice she had sought her entire life. Rachel was also emotional, but her feelings were mixed with worry. She knew the legal victory was just the beginning. Enforcing the judgment and actually taking possession of the properties would be another challenge. As expected, the Harrison family appealed the decision, but Attorney David was confident. "Ladies, they have the right to appeal, but the chances of a reversal are minimal. The evidence is too clear." While awaiting the appeal hearing, Rachel and Mrs. Margaret had to deal with the consequences of the victory. The news spread quickly throughout the region, creating very different reactions. Many people supported the decision, seeing it as a victory of justice over the abuse of power. Others, especially those economically dependent on the Harrison family, were worried about the changes that might come. Stephen, the investor's representative, approached Rachel again a few weeks after the verdict. "Ms. Rachel, our previous offer still stands. In fact, considering the favorable ruling, we can increase it to 15 million. Mr. Stephen, I appreciate the proposal, but our answer remains no. Ma'am, do you understand that enforcing this judgment is going to be very complicated? The Harrison family doesn't have 15 million in liquid assets to pay. This could turn into a battle lasting years." Mrs. Margaret answered for both of them. "Mr. Stephen, we've come too far to give up now. If it takes years, we will wait years." Stephen's prediction was correct. Enforcing the judgment proved to be much more complicated than winning it. The Harrison family claimed to have no liquid resources to pay the compensation and proposed that the lands be transferred gradually over 5 years as they managed to reorganize their operations. Attorney David vehemently opposed the proposal. "Your Honor, the defendants had decades to benefit illegally from these lands. It is not reasonable to give them another 5 years to prolong a situation that should have been corrected long ago." The judge decided on a middle ground. The Harrison family would have 2 years to transfer all properties and pay the compensation. But during that period, Rachel and Mrs. Margaret could already take possession of the lands and manage them. The first property to be transferred was the ranch where Rachel lived, which had already been in her name since Daniel's will, but now she had the undisputed legal possession. The second was a 200-acre cattle ranch, which Mrs. Margaret chose as her share of the inheritance. At 69, she moved from Charlotte to personally manage the property that had belonged to her grandfather. "Rachel," she said on the day she moved to the ranch, "I can finally set foot on my grandfather's land as the rightful owner. There's no amount of money that can buy this feeling." The other properties were gradually transferred, as established by the court. Some were coffee farms, others cattle ranches, and there was also an urban subdivision that the Harrisons had developed years before. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, continuing. The total value of the recovered estate surpassed all expectations. When everything was accounted for, Rachel and Mrs. Margaret Mitchell became the owners of an estate valued at over 60 million Rs. But material wealth wasn't the most important thing to them. What truly mattered was the feeling that justice had been served. 2 years after the verdict, on a sunny afternoon, Rachel and Mrs. Margaret Mitchell met at the place where it all began, where the trunk was found. "Mrs. Margaret, do you think your grandfather would be proud of what we've accomplished?" "I'm sure he would, my dear. He always said the truth comes out sooner or later. And now? What do we do with so much land, so much responsibility?" Mrs. Margaret smiled. "Now we do what my grandfather would have done. We work the land honestly, create jobs for the community, and ensure this property is used for the good of everyone." They decided to turn part of the land into a social project, offering employment and training for young people in the region. They also created a cooperative for small producers, helping needy families develop their own agricultural activities. The Harrison family, in turn, managed to reorganize. Without the burden of debt and with the money they obtained from the sale of other properties they legitimately owned, Richard opened an agricultural consulting firm. Mrs. Eleanor, after recovering from her health problems, moved to the city to be closer to her other children. Surprisingly, a few months after everything was settled, Richard sought out Rachel for a conversation. "Rachel, I've come here to apologize for how I treated you throughout this whole process." Rachel was surprised. Richard seemed genuinely remorseful. "I was desperate because of the family's debts and ended up doing things I'm ashamed of today. The attempt to bribe Mr. Henry was unforgivable." "Richard, I appreciate the apology. I know it was a difficult situation for everyone." "Rachel, can I make a confession? Deep down, I always knew there was something off about our family story of how we got this land. My grandfather told different versions of the same story, and it always bothered me." "Why did you never investigate?" "Out of convenience, out of fear, out of self-interest. It's easier to accept a convenient version of the truth than to face uncomfortable facts." Richard paused. "Rachel, can I propose something? My consulting firm is growing, and I'd like to offer our services to help optimize production on your properties. It would be a way to compensate, at least partially, for the mistakes of the past." Rachel discussed the proposal with Mrs. Margaret, and they decided to accept. Richard proved to be a competent and honest partner, helping them modernize the management of the properties. Over time, a genuine friendship developed between them. Richard became a sort of older brother to Rachel, and she discovered that, away from the pressure and desperation, he was a fundamentally decent person. 3 years after the discovery of the trunk, Rachel was walking through the fields of her property when she came across a scene that moved her deeply. Mrs. Margaret, now 72 years old, was teaching a group of children, grandchildren of the ranch employees, about the history of the land and the importance of agriculture. She was a woman who had spent decades quietly keeping documents and could now openly tell her family's story. "Children," Mrs. Margaret Mitchell would say, "the land does not belong to us. We belong to the land. Our role is to care for it and leave it better for the next generations." Rachel approached the group. "Is Mrs. Margaret telling you the story of her great-grandfather?" "Yes, Aunt Rachel," replied one of the children. "He was a very brave man who worked hard to build this ranch." "And do you know why it's important to know this story?" Another child raised her hand. So we never forget that ordinary people can do important things. Exactly, said Rachel, smiling. And so you know that the truth is always worth it, even when it's hard to face. That evening, Rachel and Mrs. Margaret had dinner together, as they often did since becoming neighbors. Mrs. Margaret, have you ever stopped to think about how our lives have changed? Every day, my dear. But you know something? The most important change wasn't the money or the land. What was it? It was discovering that even when everything seems lost, there's always a chance to start over. You lost your husband and almost lost your home. I spent decades carrying a hurt that seemed impossible to resolve. But look where we are, Rachel agreed. Truly, the transformation had been complete. From a young widow threatened with losing everything, she had become one of the largest landowners in the region. More importantly, she had become a respected community leader, known for her generosity and sense of justice. Mrs. Margaret, do you think John Mitchell ever imagined that one day his story would be known? I'm sure he did. Why else would he have buried those documents with such care? He knew that one day someone would find them and use the evidence to bring about justice. It's a great responsibility, isn't it? Knowing we are the keepers of his memory. Yes, my dear. But it's also a privilege. How many people get the chance to right a historical wrong? A few months later, Rachel received an unexpected visit. It was a reporter from a regional newspaper who wanted to do a story about the Mitchell family history and the recovery of the land. Miss Rachel, this story has all the elements of a drama. Historical injustice, mysterious discovery, legal battle, and a happy ending. Are you interested in turning this into a book or a movie? Rachel looked at Mrs. Margaret, who was present for the conversation. Reporter, our story is not entertainment. It's the real life of real people who suffered real injustices. But that's precisely why it could inspire other people going through similar situations. Mrs. Margaret thought for a few moments. You know something. Maybe she's right, Rachel. If our story can encourage other people to fight for their rights, maybe it's worth telling. They ended up agreeing to the publication of the article, but on the condition that the emphasis be placed on the importance of fighting for justice, regardless of the difficulties. The report was published and had a much greater impact than either of them expected. People from all over the state got in touch, telling similar stories of families who had lost property under dubious circumstances. Attorney David found himself sought out by dozens of people wanting his help to investigate similar cases. He decided to specialize in historical land issues and became a leading authority on the subject. Ladies, he said during one of his visits, you started a movement. People are investigating land irregularities that happened decades ago, and many are finding evidence. Is that good or bad? Asked Rachel. It's good for justice, but it can be complicated for social stability. When many properties start being questioned at the same time, it can create instability. Mrs. Margaret had a different view. Attorney David, if a property was obtained dishonestly, it should be questioned, no matter how much time has passed. Justice doesn't have an expiration date. I agree with you in principle, but in practice it's not always possible to apply justice absolutely without causing bigger problems. The issue became more complex when other families in the region began investigating the origins of their properties, inspired by the case of Rachel and Mrs. Margaret. Some discovered their lands had been acquired legitimately. Others found evidence of irregularities, and some discovered they were descendants of families that had been wronged in the past, like the Mitchell family. The situation reached a point where Father William suggested creating a local commission to investigate and mediate these cases, preventing each from becoming a separate legal battle. Rachel, he said, you've opened a Pandora's box. Now we need to find a way to deal with the consequences fairly for everyone. The commission was created, and Rachel agreed to participate as a representative of the wronged families. Mrs. Margaret, despite her age, also wanted to participate, bringing her perspective as someone who had waited decades for justice. The commission's work was long and delicate. They investigated dozens of cases, some dating back more than a century. In many cases, the evidence was insufficient or contradictory. In others, they found clear evidence of irregularities. The approach they developed was pragmatic. When there was clear evidence of irregularities, they sought ways to compensate the wronged families without necessarily taking the land from the families that currently owned it. This usually involved financial compensation or partial property transfers. It's not perfect justice, Rachel admitted during one of the commission meetings, but it's better than leaving the wrongs completely uncorrected. The commission's work extended for nearly 2 years. In the end, they managed to resolve most of the identified cases amicably, avoiding long and costly legal battles. The model they developed drew attention in other regions, and similar commissions were created in several towns in rural Kentucky. 5 years after the discovery of the chest, Rachel was celebrating her 33rd birthday at a party organized by Mrs. Margaret at her ranch. The party brought together the entire local community, including Richard and even Mrs. Eleanor, who had reconciled with Rachel after the whole process. During the party, Mr. Henry approached Rachel. "Rachel, can I say something? When you arrived here as Daniel's wife, I thought you were just another city girl who wouldn't adapt to rural life. And what changed your mind? When I saw you digging that trench alone, under the hot sun, determined to improve the property, that's when I knew you had grit." "I'm glad I was digging that trench," said Rachel, laughing. "If it weren't for that, none of this would have happened." Father William, who was nearby, joined the conversation. "Rachel, have you ever stopped to think that maybe it wasn't a coincidence? Maybe it was divine providence that you chose to dig exactly in that spot?" "Father, it wasn't a choice. It was the most logical place to install the water system." "And why was it the most logical place?" Rachel thought for a few moments. "Because of the land's topography and the proximity to the artesian well." "Exactly. John Mitchell chose to bury the chest in a place where sooner or later someone would dig for practical reasons. He thought of everything." The priest's observation made Rachel reflect on how every detail of the story had fit together perfectly. If she hadn't lost Daniel, she wouldn't have inherited the ranch. If the Harrison family hadn't pressured her, she wouldn't have dug the pit. If she hadn't dug the pit, she would never have found the chest. "Father, are you suggesting all this was predetermined?" "Not predetermined, but facilitated. Sometimes the universe conspires for justice to be done, but it always needs human action to bring it about." During the party, Mrs. Margaret gave a moving speech. "Friends, when I was a child and heard my grandmother telling stories about the injustices our family had suffered, I thought they were just sad stories from the past. I never imagined that one day I would have the chance to right those wrongs." She looked at Rachel. "Rachel, you were the instrument Providence used to bring about justice. Without your courage and determination, my grandfather would still be remembered as someone who lost his land through incompetence, instead of being recognized as a victim of an injustice." "Mrs. Margaret, I only did what any honest person would do in my situation." "No, my dear, you did what a courageous person would do. Any honest person would be outraged by the injustice, but not every honest person would have the courage to confront a powerful family to set it right." The party continued late into the night, with music, dancing, and many conversations about the past and future of the region. At the end of the night, when only Rachel and Mrs. Margaret remained on the house porch, watching the stars, they reflected on everything that had happened. "Mrs. Margaret, if you could go back in time, would you do it all again?" "Without hesitation, and you?" "Me too. Even knowing all the difficulties we would face." "You know why, Rachel? Because some fights are worth it, regardless of the outcome. When we fight for justice, we win even when we lose." "How so?" "We gain dignity, we gain peace of mind, we gain our own self-respect. That no one can take from us." Rachel looked at the land around her, now officially hers, and thought of Daniel. He would be proud to know that she not only kept his inheritance, but discovered and corrected a historical injustice in the process. "Mrs. Margaret, what do you think comes next?" "Next, my dear, we live. We enjoy what we've achieved, but without forgetting how we achieved it. And we pass this story on to the next generation so they know it's worth fighting for their rights." In the following years, Rachel established herself as one of the main rural leaders in the region. Her properties became models of sustainable agriculture and social responsibility. She created education programs for rural youth, cooperatives for small producers, and an assistance fund for families in need. Mrs. Margaret, despite her advanced age, remained active in managing her farm until she was 76, when she decided to officially retire, handing over management to nephews who came from Charlotte. "Rachel," she said on the day she formalized her retirement, "I have fulfilled my mission. Grandpa John's property is back in the hands of the Mitchell family, productive and prosperous. Now I can rest in peace." "Mrs. Margaret, you're not leaving the region, are you?" "Never, my dear. Now that I've reclaimed my family's land, I will stay here until my last day." And so it was. Mrs. Margaret lived another 8 years after her retirement, always close to Rachel, following the development of the region and the growth of the social projects they had created together. When she turned 80, the town organized a party in her honor, recognizing her contribution to correcting historical injustices and to the social development of the region. During the party, the mayor announced that a rural school was being named in her honor, the John and Mary Mitchell Rural School, combining her grandfather's name and her own. "Mrs. Margaret," said the mayor in his speech, "you have taught us that it is never too late to fight for justice and that persistence can overcome any obstacle." Rachel, now 40 years old, was by Mrs. Margaret's side during the ceremony. The two had become not just business partners but true friends, united by an experience that had transformed their lives. After the party, as they were returning home, Mrs. Margaret made a confession to Rachel. "My dear, can I tell you a secret I've kept all these years?" "Of course, Mrs. Margaret. When I learned about your situation with the Harrison family, I already knew you had found something on the property." Rachel was surprised. "How did you know?" "Because I had also searched before. When I was young in the 1970s, I came here a few times with my father. We knew Grandpa had buried something, because he had left some clues in the documents that stayed with me." "And why did you never find it?" "Because we didn't have permission to dig on the property, and also because at that time the Harrisons had much more power. It would have been impossible to confront them." "So you were waiting for the right opportunity?" "Exactly. When I learned that you had inherited the property and were being pressured, I realized that perhaps it was the moment I had waited for my whole life." The revelation made Rachel understand that her discovery had not been as accidental as she thought. Mrs. Margaret had carefully orchestrated the right moment for the truth to come to light. "Mrs. Margaret, did you use me? I would say we used each other, but for a noble purpose. You needed help to keep your inheritance, and I needed someone with legal legitimacy to access the property where the evidence was buried. And if I hadn't found the chest? Then I would have told you everything I knew, and we would have searched together. But the fact that you found it first made everything much more convincing." Rachel did not feel manipulated. In fact, she admired Mrs. Margaret's intelligence and patience even more. "You planned all this for decades." "My dear, when you wait for justice for so long, you learn to be very careful with the opportunities that arise." 2 years after this conversation, Mrs. Margaret passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 82. She had lived to see the complete resolution of all the cases of the Land Issues Commission and the consolidation of the social projects she and Rachel had created. At the funeral, hundreds of people from across the region attended, including many families who had benefited from the Commission's work. Richard was present, as were former employees of the Harrisons who now worked on Rachel's properties. Father William, now almost 80, conducted the ceremony. Mrs. Margaret was an example of how patience, determination, and faith in justice can overcome any adversity, he said in his homily. She taught us that some fights are too important to be abandoned, even when they seem impossible. Rachel gave the final speech at the funeral. "Mrs. Margaret taught me that our lives gain meaning when we fight for something greater than ourselves. She dedicated decades to preserving her family's memory and to the pursuit of justice. Thanks to your persistence, not only was your family honored, but our entire community learned valuable lessons about courage and determination." After the funeral, Rachel also inherited the properties of Mrs. Margaret. who had no children and had made her the universal heir. "She left me everything," Rachel said to Father William. "Not just the lands, but also the responsibility to continue the work we started together." "And will you continue?" "Of course. It's what she would have wanted, and it's what I feel I must do." With Mrs. Margaret's properties, Rachel became one of the largest landowners in the state. But instead of focusing solely on profits, she expanded the social projects and transformed her ranches into centers of sustainable rural development. 10 years after the discovery of the trunk, Rachel was organizing Mrs. Margaret's personal archive when she found a sealed envelope with her name written in her deceased friend's handwriting. Inside was a letter that Mrs. Margaret had written shortly before passing away. "My dear Rachel," the letter said, "if you are reading this, it means I have completed my journey and left you the responsibility to continue our work. I want you to know that you were much more than a partner in the search for justice. You were like a daughter to me, giving me in the last years of my life a family I never had. When we found that trunk, we didn't just find gold and documents. We found purpose. We found a cause that gave meaning to our lives. Now it's your turn to decide how to use the wealth and influence we have gained. I am sure you will make the right choices, because I have come to know your heart, and I know it is generous and just. Always remember, we do not inherit the earth from our ancestors, we borrow it from our descendants. Use it well. With all my love and gratitude, Margaret." The letter deeply moved Rachel and reinforced her determination to honor Mrs. Margaret's legacy. 15 years after the discovery of the trunk, on a sunny spring morning, Rachel was walking through the fields where it all began when she noticed a new building being erected nearby. It was the new headquarters of the John and Margaret Mitchell Foundation, an organization she had created to institutionalize and expand all the social projects they had developed over the years. The foundation offered rural education programs, microcredit for small producers, free technical assistance, and also maintained a research center on historical land issues. "It's impressive how everything has changed," commented Mr. Henry, now 75 but still active on the property. "Changed for the better," replied Rachel. "Sometimes I think about what would have happened if I had never found that trunk." "You would have found a way to succeed anyway," said Mr. Henry with conviction. "People like you always find a way." "People like me?" "People who don't give up when they know they're right." That afternoon, Rachel received a visit from a young journalist who was writing a book about inspiring stories of rural women. "Mrs. Rachel, your story has been told many times, but I would like to focus on a different aspect. How did a casual discovery turn into a social justice movement?" "First," corrected Rachel, "it wasn't a casual discovery. It was the result of a sequence of conscious choices I made along the way." "What kind of choices?" "The choice not to accept the pressure from the Harrison family, the choice to trust Mrs. Margaret, the choice to seek the truth, even when it was easier to take the money and leave." "And what motivated you to make those choices?" Rachel thought for a few moments before answering. "You know, when Daniel passed away, I felt as if I had lost not only my husband, but also my identity. I was his wife, lived in his house on his land. When he passed, I no longer knew who I was. And how did discovering the trunk change that? It gave me a cause of my own, a mission that was mine, not an extension of someone else's life. For the first time in my adult life, I was fighting for something that was genuinely mine. And today, how would you define yourself? Today, I see myself as a guardian of a legacy, not just the material legacy I secured, but the moral legacy of not accepting injustices passively." The conversation with the journalist made Rachel reflect on her personal journey. She had started as a young, vulnerable widow, threatened with losing everything. Now, at 43, she was a respected leader, a successful businesswoman, and an influential social activist. But the most important transformation had been internal. She had discovered her own strength, her capacity for leadership, and her commitment to justice. A few weeks after the interview, Rachel received an unexpected call. It was from an attorney in New York representing a family who had found old documents suggesting they too had been victims of land appropriation decades earlier. Mrs. Rachel, we heard about the work you did in your region, and we would like to ask for your help in establishing a similar commission here in the interior of New York. It was recognition that the model she and Mrs. Margaret had developed was being replicated in other regions, potentially helping hundreds of families correct historical injustices. Of course, Rachel replied, it would be a pleasure to share our experience. During the following months, Rachel traveled regularly to New York, helping to establish and train the new commission. The work was voluntary, but she considered it a way to honor Mrs. Margaret's memory. The success of the New York Commission led to invitations from other regions. Within 2 years, Rachel was consulting for similar commissions in 4 different states. You've become a national expert in resolving historical land conflicts, commented Attorney David during one of his visits. I never imagined my life would take this turn, Rachel admitted. When I found that trunk, I just wanted to solve my personal problems. And you did. But in the process, you discovered you had the talent and passion to solve bigger problems. It's strange how life works, isn't it? Sometimes our greatest achievements come from our greatest difficulties. On one of her trips to New York, Rachel met Alexander, a human rights attorney who worked on land issues with Quilombola communities. Alexander was 45, a widower like her, and shared her passion for social justice. What began as a professional partnership gradually evolved into something personal. Rachel, he said during a dinner after a work meeting, can I make a confession? When I heard your story, I expected to meet a fervent activist, perhaps a bit radical. But you are very different from what I imagined. Different how? You're pragmatic, balanced, able to see all sides of an issue. That's rare in people who have fought so hard for their convictions. Perhaps it's because my fight was never ideological, Rachel reflected. It was always very personal, very human. Their relationship developed slowly, built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared values. Alexander perfectly understood Rachel's responsibilities to her properties and social projects, just as she respected his commitment to the communities he served. 2 years after their first meeting, they decided to marry in a simple ceremony at the ranch where it all began. Father William, now 82 years old, conducted the ceremony. Rachel, said the priest during the homily, when you arrived here as a young bride, I never imagined that one day I would be celebrating your second marriage as a mature woman who has become a symbol of justice and determination. The marriage represented another chapter in Rachel's personal transformation. With Alexander, she had found not just a companion, but a partner who shared her worldview and her life goals. Together, they expanded the scope of their social projects even further, creating programs that addressed both rural land issues and the rights of urban traditional communities. 20 years after the discovery of the chest, Rachel was organizing a large celebration in memory of Mrs. Margaret. It was the 10th anniversary of her passing, and she wanted to mark the date with the launch of a book telling the full story of her struggle. The book had been written in partnership with the journalist who had interviewed her years before, and all profits would go to the John and Margaret Mitchell Foundation. During the launch party, which brought together hundreds of people from across the country, Rachel gave a speech summarizing everything she had learned on her journey. Friends, she said, 20 years ago I was a young widow struggling to maintain the inheritance my husband had left. Today I am a mature woman, fortunate to have found new love and a life's mission. She looked at Alexander, who was in the front row. Life has taught me that the greatest riches are not those we find buried in the ground, but those we build with our own hands. True relationships, just causes, and the peace of mind of one who fought for what is right. Mrs. Margaret used to say that the truth always comes out sooner or later, and I would add, but it needs brave people to bring it to light. The chest I found 20 years ago contained gold and documents, but the true wealth was in the opportunity to do justice, the chance to correct a historical injustice, and the possibility of building something greater than our own individual lives. Richard, now a successful businessman and a genuine friend of Rachel's, was present at the party. Rachel, he said during his speech, On behalf of my family, I want to thank you for the dignified way you handled this entire situation. You could have destroyed us, but you chose a path that allowed everyone to emerge stronger. Richard, revenge destroys both the one who gives it and the one who receives it. Justice, on the other hand, can be harsh, but it can also be redemptive. During the party, many people approached Rachel to tell her how her story had inspired their own fights for justice. A young lawyer told how she had decided to specialize in human rights after reading about her case. A farmer said he had found the courage to report land irregularities in his region after learning the story of the Mitchell family. A teacher revealed that she used the story of Rachel and Mrs. Margaret as an example in her classes on citizenship and rights. "It's amazing how one story can echo and inspire other stories," Alexander commented to Rachel as they observed the animated conversations of the guests. "It's what Mrs. Margaret always said, when we do the right thing, good multiplies." 3 years after the book launch, Rachel received an invitation that surprised her. The federal government wanted to appoint her to join a national commission to review historical land conflict cases. "It's a great responsibility," Alexander said when she told him about the invitation, "but it's also national recognition for the work you've been doing." "I'm hesitating precisely because of the responsibility," Rachel admitted. "It's easy to resolve local issues, where I know the people and the circumstances. National issues are far more complex. But that's exactly why they need someone like you, someone who understands that behind every case, there are real people with real stories." Rachel accepted the invitation and began dividing her time between her properties and the activities of the National Commission in Washington, D.C. The work was challenging but also rewarding. The commission managed to peacefully resolve hundreds of conflicts that had seemed unsolvable, using the methodology she and Mrs. Margaret had developed years before. During one of the commission meetings, one of the members remarked, "Rachel, your approach is unique. You can see the human side of legal issues and find solutions that satisfy both justice and social peace." "I learned that from Mrs. Margaret," she replied. "She taught me that justice isn't just about punishing those who did wrong, but about correcting what is wrong in a way that allows everyone to move forward." 25 years after the discovery of the chest, Rachel was again at the place where it had all begun. Now there was a small memorial there in honor of John Mitchell and his family, built on the exact spot where the chest had been found. The memorial consisted of a simple bronze plaque with the names of John and Mary Mitchell, and an inscription that read, "Truth and justice may be delayed, but they always arrive." Rachel visited the memorial regularly, especially on important dates. It was her way of keeping the memory of Mrs. Margaret alive and reflecting on everything they had achieved together. That morning, she was accompanied by her niece Julia, daughter of Alexander from his first marriage, who had become very close to Rachel. "Aunt Rachel," asked Julia, now 20 years old and a law student, "do you still think about what might have happened if you had never found the chest?" "Sometimes," admitted Rachel, "but not with nostalgia or regret. I think of it more as an exercise in reflecting on how small decisions can have big consequences." "What kind of decisions?" "The decision to dig the pit exactly in that spot, the decision to trust Mrs. Margaret, the decision not to accept the money offers in exchange for silence. Each of those decisions seemed small at the time, but together they completely changed the course of my life." "And do you regret any of them?" Rachel looked at the memorial, then at the surrounding fields, now prosperous and well-kept, then at the foundation headquarters in the distance where dozens of people worked daily to help other families. "No," she said firmly, "not a single one." That late afternoon, as she watched the sunset from the same spot where she had dug the pit 25 years earlier, Rachel made a final reflection on her journey. She had started as a young widow, struggling to maintain an inheritance. She had become a mature woman who transformed a personal discovery into a life's mission. She had found not only a buried treasure, but also a just cause, a true friendship, a new love, and a purpose that gave meaning to every day of her life. "Mrs. Margaret," she murmured, looking at the stars beginning to appear in the sky, "we fulfilled our mission. We brought justice to your grandfather. We honored your family's memory, and we still managed to help many other people along the way." A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the trees around her, as if it were a tender response from the friend who had departed. Rachel smiled and walked back to the house, where Alexander waited for her with a prepared dinner and plans to further expand the social projects that had become their trademark. At 48, she knew she still had many years ahead to continue making a difference. And she also knew that, regardless of what the future might bring, she would always carry with her the lessons she had learned on that extraordinary journey that had begun with a simple septic tank being dug on a sunny morning. The wealth she had found buried was real and had changed her life materially. But the true wealth had been discovering her own strength, her capacity for leadership, and her unwavering commitment to justice. And this wealth, unlike coins and jewels, could not be buried or stolen. It was hers forever. End of story. Now tell me what you thought of this story and where you are watching from. If you have something to share with us, leave it in the comments with sincere words. Do you believe Rachel made the right decisions throughout her journey? We would love to read your opinion on this incredible story of overcoming and justice.